coming today and struggling through the parking difficulties and everything involved in that. We appreciate you visiting. I'm the president of Strata Gallery, the founder, and I'm also the artist whose work is on display. We've been in this location for 1 week. So there's been a lot of turmoil involved. And we're very happy with the location. It's a big upgrade on our previous space. And just a little bit about Strata. We're a non-profit gallery. We are funded in large part by artist members. They choose to be members and have exhibitions with us. But we also help emerging artists. So each year we have an open call for emerging artists to be members of the gallery. This year we got 127 artists applied. We can only have 5 in a year, and each one gets 2 weeks show with us for free. They're on our website and they connect with our established members. They're mentored by them to some degree. So there's a nice relationship between different layers of artists, if you like. And the idea occurred to me because I used to teach for a long time in California in a Cal State campus, and I came to learn how artists with very few financial resources really struggle even after grad school to make a career. So I felt like if we could do something to help a few of them every year, that seemed really meaningful. So that's basically what we do. We operate on a shoestring budget, so any donations gratefully received as well. Today's event is going to be poetry reading by Donald Levering. Many of you know him already. Very known, published poet. He's done, this is your fourth reading?
For Strata?
Third. He's done 2 previous readings in Strata. This is the first one, and I'm privileged to say this, that the poems are a response to artwork, in this instance my artwork. So I feel very privileged. I suggested the possibility to Donald because I can relate. There are overlaps between areas that we deal with in our works, so I felt it was a good mix. Unfortunately, Donald did too. The poems he's going to be reading you are related to this piece here, Four Spoon Father. This piece over here, Roving Eye, and this piece, actually I let Don actually title this and call his poem up, which I thought was fun, so it's called Backside Pilgrimage. And just to give you a tiny, short background on the kind of what these are, because it's confusing to some people. About 5 years ago, I was making predominantly sculptures, mostly assemblages that went on the wall. A little bit like the ones you see here. So at a certain point, I had too many of them to store, and I ceased making them. And I had my studio assistant, Jennifer Fan, who's also the director of the gallery, who started it with me, photograph everything. She's a photographer. And then the photographs are printed large, and then I work over them a lot. So they change quite dramatically, usually, from the original sculpture. So that's basically what you're looking at with all the work. Started out as a photograph of a sculpture. So, was anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay, and you'll see that Donald has a number of the volumes of his published poetry available for sale in cards and so on. Also, if you haven't already, there are printed copies of the poems, if anyone wants to grab one.
Raise your hand if you need one. Anybody else need one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, things are free.
Anybody else?
If you want, I can take this one as well.
Yeah.
Okay, one more. We have another customer here. Here we go. All right, we have one on top.
Basically the format is that Donald will read a poem and then we'll talk about it a bit together, and then there'll be chance for questions and then we'll move on to the next one.
But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about ekphrastic writing, which is what these poems are called. Ekphrastic, E-K-P-H-R-A-S-T-I-C. So it comes from a Greek word that basically means to describe. And ekphrastic poems, ekphrastic writing describes art, but it hopefully does more. So I wrote a little definition. Ekphrastic poetry is writing that uses poetic forms and techniques to describe, react to, interact with, or embellish a work of art, usually visual, but other art forms, such as music, dance, photography or film, sculpture, architecture may be subjects of ekphrasis. And there are some people here that have been in a workshop with me in which we went into great detail with this, and so I'm going to go, 40,000 foot view, just mention some ekphrastic poems you may be familiar with. So you see that this is coming from a tradition, through a tradition. The most famous, Homer's description of Achilles' Shield, which is basically, it's an imaginary ekphrasis, because Homer, well, he couldn't have seen it if even if there was a real shield, because he was blind, but it still is a major example of ekphrastic writing where he describes a work of art, in this case the shield, Achilles' shield, in exquisite detail. You all know Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. Truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That's all you know, all you need to know. That is obviously on a work of art. Getting up more into more contemporary art brings The Bridge, a whole book that centers around the Brooklyn Bridge, piece of architecture. Most famous 19th century poem that was an ekphrastic poem was on a painting by, Jean-Francois Millet did this painting called Man with a Hoe. And then Edwin Markham wrote this poem on that became sort of it ignited a whole social movement about labor, about treating laborers fairly. So that's this is when ekphrasis starts moving into social issues as well. Probably the most famous of the 20th century ekphrastic poems is Auden's poem Musée des Beaux-Arts, which takes on the fall of Icarus, famous Bruegel painting. And also Bruegel, or Bruegel, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. His work inspired a whole book called Pictures from Bruegel by Wynne Carlos Williams that got a Pulitzer Prize. And just one more example, Anne Sexton wrote a poem called Starry Night, and you can all guess what painting that is from. So, I want to mention also just that there can't be a one-to-one relationship between the art and the ekphrastic poem. They are different works of art, but one of them uses the other as inspiration. And if you think about, art is made of physical materials. Poems are words, sounds. Art is generally, at least visual art, that on some level you apprehend it all at once. And of course, poems, like music, you perceive through time. So in those are two crucial ways in which the ekphrastic poem can't be like identical or married to the art that it's based on. So there are some methods or techniques that we use for writing ekphrastic, and I'll just list them. So one of them is just to kind of comment on the art. And I should also say these are not mutually exclusive methodologies. You can relate the plot or story that's in a work of art, and sometimes, particularly some of the older classical paintings, they would refer to something, some classical myth or some biblical story, and then there'll be the artist, the poem that then describes that interaction. But when we get to work like David's, we have a multitude of imagery that gives the poet kind of free rein to say, well, what story do we have here? So basically the method I used was to create a plot based on the imagery. But some other methods are to personally relate to the work, and or to speak in the voice of a character that is in the work of art, or portrayed in the work of art, or even have a dialogue with that person. That sometimes there are poems that do that as well, or converse. I guess that does it on that. Now, so there we are, 40,000 feet with the ekphrastic writing. Now let's talk about David's poems. Actually, I think you just invited me to come do a reading, and then I looked at David's work and I saw, well, why not turn this into an ekphrastic kind of event? And so what I was working from was actually, it was before the show was put up, I was working from digital, copies that he sent me. So some of the details I didn't really see until last week when I came here and saw. I read the poems based on what I could detect from the digital images. Let's see. I wanted to also, there's a review of David's work that I wanted to quote because I think I didn't read it until after I wrote the poems, but I thought after I read this review, or piece of the review, that I thought he really summarized my reaction just in a prosaic way. So he says, this is the reviewer Mark Van Proyen. David Olivant's Retroglyphs, so that's the title, that's the label you've given this process that he described to you just a while ago. His retroglyphs invite their viewers to adopt the mindset of the archaeologist who sifts through diverse iconographic clues to recover a forgotten and possibly repressed narrative pertaining to the loss of hope and a fall from grace. Each and all seem like fragmentary scenes salvaged and reconstructed from the remnants of bygone circumstances, presented in compressed layers of pictorial activity that are provisionally sutured together to recreate something resembling a crime scene. We are left unsure as to whether or not something bad has happened or is about to happen. But either way, a human dilemma is revealed. So I just thought that was
I should just add that whether or not something bad has happened is the title of the show. And the piece there, which was finished 4 days before the show opened, is called Something Bad, and it's written across it in illuminated manuscript letters. The big piece there. So I'm also quoting from the review.
Okay, so I guess before I go any further, I should say that, as a poet, what I'm doing may be considered by other poets a diminishment of the poetry by talking so much about the poems, and how they got there. So be it. It's, sometimes you do that. And David also, I think, is being generous by letting me have an interpretation that I put down in writing. That he may not have intended anything like that, but that's just how it goes, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, any questions so far? All right. Four Spoon Father is this one here. And I'll just note some of the things that I was looking at as I worked on the poem. So it says Four Spoon Father, so no doubt about what the intention is in terms of the title. 1, 2, 3, 4 spoons. You'll notice this figure here, if you look closely at this, it's actually constructed of an old-fashioned shoehorn. And then I call this a Pinocchio nose for obvious reasons. This looked like a Giacometti figure to me, this gaunt figure there. This figure is like a man that's in flight. He's got wings on his ankles and wings there on his, coming out of the shoulder blades. And it appears that, even here, there is a head on the platter. And you can't see the head of the figure, so he may be bearing his own head on a platter. It's something to think about. The largest figure in the painting, I feel like I'm blocking for you guys, and then
Yeah, that's
let's see,
pretty
maybe this is better. Okay. The largest figure in the painting is this backside of what I took to be a younger woman. And within her, there's a horse, and there's the sort of the nave of the cathedral. Other things that I noticed here, there are reels here, as in old-fashioned home movies, like my dad used to take videos of us and then run it through that old-fashioned. There are 3 white-haired men here that I take to be uncles and that show up in the movies. This horizontal kind of floating looks to me like a Madonna figure, and she looks like she's topless. So there's some issues there, perhaps. This shape here, you can see there's eyes. It looks to me like a mask, and I took it to be kind of an ancestor mask. Then this here, when I looked at an electronic version of it, it looked like a face within an old TV cabinet, and I took this to be like David Brinkley or something, giving the news. What's the news? Well, it could have something to do with this. This is like an airplane, but it's also a crossbow put together as one artifact. And to me, that started, crossbow. I started thinking about war, and then I see these maps. So I started thinking about war and maps, and obviously Ukraine then would pop up. This is the current war that we're exposed to on our TVs. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I'm going to read the poem. After a retroglyph by David Olivant, 4 Spoon Father, with his shoe tree jaw and Pinocchio nose, Father's constructing a crossbow cargo plane to airlift relief to Ukraine. At meals, he endeavors to spoon-feed his progeny a pablum of the news. But the war supposed to be locked in the TV cabinet, is loose and loud in our living room. To each of 3 sons he hands a spoon heaped with his intentions for comfort food, while his daughter uses hers to stir confusion. Father turns wheels into reels to spool to his family home movies, where kindly white-haired uncles pose on movable stairs. But the daughter upstages them all, turning her back on the scene to lead her horse into the cathedral. Hard-working father soothes his daughter's complaints of her swollen arm. His face grows Giacometti gaunt. The Christian Madonna he'd urged her to honor flaunted her Holy Father, went topless and laid herself down. And the kids have lost interest in spooning Dad's reverence. Their ancestor mask is moldering, while Father's 2 sets of wings, one at his ankles and one at his shoulder blades, have to beat fast to bear him with his head on a platter to each of the howitzered towns on the maps of Ukraine. Now I will invite David to see what he thinks of this response, and if it has anything to do with what he was up to.
Should I stand? So thank you. First of all, I feel very privileged to have a poem of that quality written about my stuff. And I think what's most important to me is that the poem definitely captures the central mood, the feelings that are evoked in the image. And that's more important than whether a particular aspect of imagery is interpreted as the exact place or the exact person. It's also interesting that in a work of art, unless you're dealing with a figure who's publicly known, the characters don't have names. So you're only going on other visual clues and context to know who you're looking at. You'd have to know something about me to know that this was my dad in his 80s, hence the father word. I don't expect anybody else to know that. So that's an in piece of information for me. In terms of interpreting the imagery, I think there were no interpretations that I would say were out in left field, you know. They were reasonable, and I think as an artist, I always expect a degree of openness in the possible meanings of images and possible references or possible interpretations. There's a limit to that, of course, otherwise why bother? So it's clear that this is a male and not a female. It's clear it's a human and not a rabbit. So there are limits that way, but there's also plenty of room, particularly within the multiple contexts of interpreting the imagery and within quite a range. So the fact that Donald interpreted this as Ukraine, even though those maps aren't actually literally Ukraine, and he couldn't have known that from the digital print, still the fact that he's brought Ukraine. Actually, I think this would be better if they were maps of Ukraine after the events. So I think it's good also that I learn things, I learn limitations, and I learn what works in a visual artwork when another kind of artist interprets it in a literary way. So I feel very positive about this response, and I think it stands on its own as a great poem, but it's also interesting to have that connection for me.
Thank you, David. Any of you have comments or questions just on this work? We'll have a time at the end when we can have free questions, but if you specifically have a burning question about Four Spoon Father, we can do that. Right?
Actually, one thing I should add that I didn't mention is this: the figure of the younger woman is the back view of Jennifer Van, who is the director, founding director of this gallery, and it's one of her photographs of her own back view. She gives me the off-prints periodically, and sometimes they get incorporated in the work. So you wouldn't know that either, but you might know that stylistically it feels quite different to other elements in the piece. And of course, Don had no idea of that.
No.
What's always striking to me about your work is the rhythm. I mean, you know, and the kind of time that's in the piece, because it's not, you know, like looking over the ocean where you're you know, flying on it and you're present. It's more stuff coming at you, and you're in a car maybe with 20 people, and you know, Volkswagen car with, you know, 20 people right there. And I'm wondering how that rhythm got, how you responded to it, Donald, in terms of, and if that was an apt description.
I think it's an apt description.
Yeah, in terms of the rhythm of the piece, wow. I feel like there's a lot going back from the past to the present. It seems like that's where it kind of swings between the two, is my feeling.
Yeah, I think it's layered in terms of parts. Partly because the images that are photographed are from work that was made 5 years ago or more. And that work itself incorporates fragments from work I made 25 years ago, like the ceramic sculptures in there. So there's definitely, I'm very interested, more probably than most visual artists, in temporality in work. And I think also my work is more, you jump from one time frame to another, time's fragmented. It's more like a poem in that way than a lot of visual art. So although, yeah, you can take in a visual image in theory all in one go, you don't really take it in. You know, you know you've seen it, but you have to break it down as well. Your eye works through it in sequences. And one thing I thought Donald did very well was, you know, my pieces are fragmented. I sensed you got that in your poem. The poem breaks into units in a way. So I felt you reflected that rhythm.
Yeah.
And it sort of unravels the piece too. I thought the poem, you know, there's a lot going on in the piece, and the poem kind of takes it all apart and shows us how to look.
Yeah, it becomes one very tangible potential narrative poem that the image weaves. And that was very intriguing to me. It showed me, well, if I was more explicit about the narrative, somehow, if that were possible, how that would come out.
Should we move on to backside opening? I might ask, when it gets to the reading part of this, there's two voices in the poem. I might ask if there be a volunteer to read one of the voices. Not this second, let's talk about it first. Just, yeah. So, here I'm blocking. Okay. Wow, this piece to me is the most emotional of the three pieces that I worked on. I just right away I'm struck by this guy down here is in awful straits, and he seems to be lorded over by this figure that is sort of half human, half jackal, astride this bizarre donkey type creature. His hand, you know, so David's provisional title is Caught Red-Handed, and there's literally red hands there, swollen. He seems to be in some sort of penance, crawl, you know. That's the feeling I got from this. And the poor man has got this, something that is tightly constricting his head. And so this is where, you know, my literalism just goes crazy. This looks to me, I think David told me it's not, but it looks to me like a volume, and it's upside down, but the writing says BIRCH. And I started thinking of the John Birch Society. And this is sort of like jammed into the side of this guy's head. What else? We've got a horse that is fleeing or going away from. We have this woman with sort of disfigured blotched skin or something, and a bubble here. What looks to be like a bubble, but there's water. And the two female figures, this one is bent over this way, and the other one is bent over backwards. So, you know, nothing is sort of really, everything seems to be a posture of excruciating pain in some way. And then we have these lovely, what I took of as mountains and someplace exotic like Patagonia, so I call that Patagonia, which would be maybe where somebody like this guy would escape to if he had a horse and Patagonia wasn't so far away. But you know, the tension in this, there's also these hands that are, what are they doing? These are, you know, like, sort of like that, and this one is reaching, there's two hands there. One would want them to be helping hands, but they're not really helping, you know, just everything is, there's sort of something in the back that is very far distant, this sort of green, paradisical looking area, but that's not the way everything's going. Everything's going away from that. So, and then, all right, so this was, so David called it caught red-handed, and then I called it backside pilgrimage, because I'm seeing a kind of a perverse pilgrimage going on. Would anybody like to join me to read the second part? Okay.
Should we from here? Or
Yeah, you can do it from there. So the way we'll do this is we're looking at backside pilgrimage. We're just going to go like this. So you read the first word. So I see this as two voices, and one voice is second person, and you voice talking to you, and the other is first person voice. But they're both expressing, it's like, to me, there's so much emotion in this. There's one voice can't take it, can't express it all. So that's why this came to me as two voices. Thank you, okay. So I'll read the title and then, okay, Backside Pilgrimage, caught red-handed after retrograde by David Olivant.
henceforth,
Hauled into the foreground for all to judge, thrust down on bare paving stone.
the last I'll know of womankind,
No evasions, no path home, just blazing shame.
are the blotches on my wife's backside.
The horseshoe clamped on your head is the hangover inside your tight blue helmet.
Bent over, sick with abortion.
The book of malfeasance slotted into your brain.
Hereafter,
A half hyena taskmaster on a splay-legged mule lords over you on your knees.
the single chance, my lone hope,
In your penance crawl, reciting your litany of wrongs.
for escape, my horse,
Your hand is swollen with theft. The grit of bad faith inflames your eyes.
has fled to the foothills
Propped wide open on your sorry state.
of Patagonia.
Thank you. All right, yours, David.
So, a couple of technical matters, thank you. I'm totally happy with this reading as a book. I mean, I see why. It's a piece of plywood, so it has the things that mimic pages. And I see it as injurious to the face with this character. But I saw it as the front leg of the horse, so the hoof comes out the other side of the face. And the hooves are taken from an anatomy study of a horse by Stubbs. And the plywood had the word birch stamped into it. So I guess it was birch plywood and some numbers, which I highlighted. Couple of other the hands are taken from, some of you probably know this painting, Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii. So there's a group of hands taking the oath there, which I happen to have lying around. I have these things lying around. The armour on this figure this makes it more humorous, are the panels on a metal stinger insert for a pan. If you've seen those they're made of metal plates with holes in, and they can press down onto the carrots or whatever it is you're stealing. They're also part of the horse's armour here. I think those are the main. This is a broken fruit bowl in the original sculpture. That's one of those tea bowls. It's a bit like these, you put the tea inside, put it in the pot. That's what that is. Another just anecdotal thing is the face in this image is exactly the same face as in the image behind you. And his face in that image reminds me of Mick Jagger's face. Hence the title on that one. Not that you're supposed to get it, not that you're going to know that. So just clarify those things. This is a wonderful poem. I love the fact that it's two voices. I think of if my work had voices, it would be multi-voice. I'm a huge fan of Dostoevsky, and all of his characters are multi-voice. So that's huge for me. Also, I noticed this poem is more immediate, more direct, more piercing, less metaphors than in the earlier poem, which I enjoyed greatly as well. And I like the idea half hyena, taskmaster. That would be a good title. That he may crop up in something now, a version of that. And I like what you did with I never quite knew what this structure is. I mean, I think originally the actual object was from some kind of, like a humidifier or something, plastic object, white plastic. But I like the idea of it being this horseshoe clamped on the head. And so on, the tight blue helmet. So yeah, I mean, I react very positively. That's expanded my sense of possibilities, what this is, and also nailed some down for me as well. Thank you.
Did you have, Jane?
It's a thought, but I don't know if I can quite articulate, but it's in both that one and this one. There's just the slightest bit of relief in, in the path. In this one, the path that goes back, the green,
Yeah.
and the landscape in the back, and even maybe in the space in the foregrounds. And that one, the relief is maybe the yellow on the right almost creates a sense of space and something, that's a bit of relief.
Yeah.
And then in the poem that was just read, just all the mentions of hope lost in a way.
Lost.
The loss of hope, evokes that there was something to hope for once. So it all fits together for me.
I think I would answer that with that line from T.S. Eliot, but hope if you hope for the wrong thing. But I agree with your point. Hope would be hope for the wrong thing. I can't remember the lines that preceded. But yeah, there are exits, there are escapes. Yeah, and that's important, even if they're tiny.
Yeah, because there's not a lot of them.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Other comments on this one?
I'm just curious, I mean, I see it a lot in recent poetry, but the reason you eliminate punctuation?
Just because it's another, it calls more attention to itself as a construct of language. If you look more at, focus more on just the language, if you don't.
It also seems you have a little more freedom in terms of how
Yeah.
much pause you give.
Right. Okay. Right, and what is actually linked to, what may be linked to another phrase,
That makes sense.
it's not necessarily.
It's not as tight.
The tight, yeah.
The poem and the painting both feel employing, is that the word?
Feel what?
Employing, is that a word? Like it's.
Oh, imploring.
Imploring,
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
sorry.
boring.
Yeah.
This, my head.
Interesting.
Yeah, but the poem does too, it's open, it's asking, cause there's a lot of violence in the pieces, in my mind, you know, but how much you feel for the person or not is different in the pieces, cause it's kind of so much that's
Yeah.
going on, you know, with this piece, it's more boring, you know, about it, and feels like the poem has that sense.
Well, I think maybe part of that is because that figure in the front is
Yeah.
looking back out and up at you.
Confronting.
He was a late addition, that head. I had the body, and I had no head, and I was looking around my stockpiles, you know, and he just loomed out. He just belonged there.
Right.
And I would never have invented him there, you know, if I'd have just drawn a head on. It
Right.
would never have had that force.
No,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so different than, and the book arrived later.
Yes, yeah, it arrived on top of the head, it kind of had to, yeah. Or the book leg, whichever you.
So that could be like something that you put in there that you didn't mean, you didn't know you were putting it in there, but it works for it to be in there. That it's a book with the John Birch Society in it, as
Right,
well as.
right,
Oh, that's-
absolutely.
Yeah.
I like when you have visual puns, double readings,
Yeah.
metaphors, visuals.
Okay, let's move on to roving eyes. So roving eyes is the letters,
It's just singular I.
I, thank you. Roving eye, and then I is backwards here. Those are the letters here. One of the things that that maybe you can see here, it was evident in the digital version, but it's as if these major figures, pieces of the retroglyph are floating in front of something like a scrim, like a theater curtain kind of thing. So there's something it's imposed on. And this shape here, I take this to be a roof slanting down and windows, and this seems like a tenement building to me, so I call this a tenement history. Conventional kind of moon base looking down on human affairs, and if you look closely in here, there's an image of water, looking down on water, which is obviously very appropriate for a moon image. This is, a torso that seems to be hollow, and whatever life was in it is long gone. And yet in the center of this painting is what I take to be something that takes us out of kind of the sadness of other images in it. And that's this thing that looks to me like the neck of an oud, or a musical instrument. And then this funny sort of, clamp system. It looks like something from a medical storeroom that's just kind of floating out there. And a book. And it looks like an older version of a book, older edition. This is the person that's speaking or is spoken to in the first part of the poem. And I take it he's looking east, and that this is west, and that figures into the poem. Here's the same figure as this one. Well, almost the same. This one's got a mushroom growing inside of his head there. But the one eye, so there's eyes in this, there are eyes in different places, but the one eye that's actually looking straight ahead, because the moon's looking down, this figure's looking that way, that one's looking that way. The one that's looking straight ahead is in a head that's upside down, and the other eye looks like, I took it to be like something from a clock of some sort, which, conjures time, mortality, all those things. So the roving eye, one of the things that occurs to me, this is as a title, is that every artist has a roving eye, so to speak, every poet, and we're all looking for different ways to see things, and we're always kind of looking at the world in different ways. So that's I took a positive hit on that roving eye, and I like this old book in the middle of it. So it seems like there's something a little more buoyant in this piece compared to the other two. Okay, Psalm before the scrim. So David called it roving eyes, but I call it Psalm before the scrim because there's the scrim that I think the whole thing is in front of. I turn my hunched body to face the rising sun, aching for new beginnings instead of hackneyed conclusions. I want the moon to peer down on our doings with matronly concern, even as half her tidewater head is consumed with gray washing the tenement of history. Sometimes it seems what we've been given to see what's coming straight ahead is but a single strained eye sans perspective in an upside down head. While the other eye is a clock timer to remind us of our death hovering in a hollow torso somewhere to the west. But thank God for music and sleep, for the neck of an oud tuned to the particular key of the song and the dream of the person with the bird beak. And praise science that pares back the skin to expose the hinge of human speech and the mushrooms growing in the amphitheater of the brain. Let me not neglect to say gratitude is due to levity for its display of tubes and connectors from another era's medical storeroom snaking through air. Or is it water through which also letters drift, settling into words on a torn page from an old story with a fresh view? What do you make of it, David?
Before just a couple of technical things, which is, you were spot on with, the things you noticed. I'd add in that there is actually what I see as a roving eye here, which actually roves away from the skull of the figure, which is made of an illuminated letter as well. An illuminated letter, like a medieval script letter you see in that piece. And the book itself is actually, no one could know this unless you've read it about 30 times. It's from Omen Setter's Luck by William guess. And my copy was falling apart, so pages of it have ended up in numerous pictures. This is actually a photograph from above of the water, so totally, yes, hard to mistake. And I think you got that nice in the poem, I tried to kind of evoke the roving eye by the way the letters say it, roving as well. And I think, I'm glad you found some levity. And I love the way the levity displays tubes and connectors from another era's medical store snaking through air, or is it water? I mean, that's levity with a lot of intent. So I love that part. And I love the reference to spoken and written language at the end, and the hinge of human speech. So you address speech very much, which is partly what this is about, and we've been talking all the time about, or particularly at the beginning, about the similarities and differences between the literary arts and visual arts. And I think pictures can speak, and I think poems can show. So they're often closer than we assume. And if you reduce them, which is popular, to signs, signs in a picture operate in amazingly similar ways to the signs in a verbal text. So I think you touch on a lot of that within the poem, which I really enjoy. And I also like mythologizing of the moon and the matronly concern and the half-tide waterhead leading into the grey washing tenement history here. And yeah, this the image that the whole thing is done on is an out of focus, is a photograph, a close-up of one of my sculptures. The part of it that's the depth of focus doesn't pick up on it, so it's all out of focus. So that's the screen, effectively. And that's something I've been experimenting with more. The parts of the photographs that I originally, I think Jennifer did too, saw, maybe she didn't, saw as mistakes because they're out. You're thinking, how's the person going to get all of this in focus? And actually it was a lot more exciting for me when big areas of it weren't in focus. So that's been used in that, and that causes the eye to rove more as well. So, thank you. Yeah, no, I thought that was a really interesting poem. I like amphitheatre of the brain. I like the fact that I mean, I wasn't thinking mushrooms, but it works. I know what I was thinking here. And this whole head is done on a sheet of acetate. We made silkscreen prints of this head as well. So it's one of the layers of acetate used in the print. And I got left with those. Some of them end up in piece. But yeah, thank you. And this is actually, the hollow torso is a fragment of a ceramic sculpture that I made of a life-size female figure that then got broken up because she was unstorable and used in different pieces.
Okay, so anybody have other comments? Yeah.
But like you, I'm gonna struggle a little to put this thought into words. First of all, I wanna say, in all of my work with visual art, I think it's so important for the viewer to have an expectation, to have a high expectation when the image is complicated and ambiguous, to have that stamina, to know that it's gonna be worth finding something. And related to that, you mentioned Homer's description of Achilles' Shield. And I remember from being an art history student that at the time we think those poems were written by Homer or whatever. The style of visual art that we have a record of is nothing like the poem. It's, I think what was called the geometric phase, where it was like triangles, lines. And so it occurs to me that whoever looked at this shield of Achilles had a very high expectation for what kind of narrative meaning would be there. And it also occurs to me that the various components, David, that you put into these retroglyphs are kind of like those geometric lines. But they coalesce, they take on meaning when we look for it. You know, when we really go in. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was very moved that you referenced Achilles Shield, and I think that's a really interesting artifact to keep in mind when we look at these works.
And there's an interesting reversal of that in depictions. Caravaggio's done it of the Medusa on the shield. So he's taking a verbal description and painting it, and in painting it, he's putting you in the same position as who's looking at Medusa. No, Medusa. Who was in the myth?
Oh, yeah.
Who was going to be turned to stone? Jason, was it? Yeah, I think so. So you're put in that position. If you look at the shield in the Caravaggio, you're going to be turned to stone as that potency. Whereas in the verbal description, that's safe.
Yeah.
That isn't going to turn you to stone. So that's a reverse transmission.
There's always been danger in images, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other comments?
So you put these retroglyphs together, you assemble them, and does a narrative assemble as you put them together? Is there a narrative or is it a theme? I'm not sure.
Well,
what the
you know,
difference is.
there's already a narrative because I start with one of these, which has a narrative.
Yeah.
Which also I put together, and the narrative evolves as I do it. So it's a kind of a narrative on top of another narrative, and there are many narratives intertwined, which I think is easier to do in visual arts, although I mean Joyce, people like that do it, of course, but I think it lends itself to visual art more readily because it's simultaneously, it tends to be. So yeah, the narrative, my sense of potential narratives develops as I make it, right?
Is developed through?
Develops during the making.
Yes.
Yeah. Sometimes I have a stronger hunch when I start than others.
Yes.
And sometimes I change my mind about what it was about after I've completed it and look back at it. That can happen.
Do you see it differently at that point?
I can do, yeah. Sometimes I do. Yeah. Or if I have a really good poet who writes something about it, and then that suggests an alternative, I'm going, okay. Because I don't think I'm the authority. I don't think the artist is the authority on the work and interpreting the work. They have a privileged position in relation to it, but they're not the authority. Mark Van Proyen or Donald Levering may have got closer to an interpretation of the work than I can as the artist. And also the artist, I believe, and the poet are not the same people who are sitting here talking to you. There's an artist, and there's a David Olivant, and there's a poet, and a Donald Levering, and they don't overlap very much when it comes down to it.
So, why do you think you're not necessarily, I think you've already answered it, why do you think you are not necessarily the authority on what you produce?
Because I think as an artist you take a completely different perspective on your work than you do as an individual. You're a different person as an artist than you are. Your ethical stance is different, your attitude to the universe is different than when you're hanging out talking when we're talking now. That you transcend that everyday personality. I mean, there are aspects of it come in, but I think they are transformed.
So you can't, at this moment sitting here, David, have a direct line to you, David the artist?
No. My only direct line to, well, I do have a little bit of a line through looking back at the work through memory. But in fact, no, the only direct line for me, this is my opinion, I mean, this is my opinion, other artists differ about
Yeah,
it. But yeah, the only direct line is what I become when I'm making the work, or at least fleetingly become. I'm not always that nurse.
So really there isn't a narrative?
Not in,
Definitive.
no, there's no definitive one, no. There are lots of wrong narratives. There are lots of narratives you can construe that I could argue were mistaken, or an art historian could argue were mistaken. You know, if you look at a crucifixion, it's clearly not the birth of Perseus, right? That's a false narrative, unless there's something in there to tie it to that.
Yeah.
But otherwise, so there are lots of wrong narratives. But there are a smaller clump, in my opinion, of intelligible narratives, if you like.
Okay.
Yeah, whoa, hands on. Where'd you go? Sorry, Marion?
Do you get surprised by your work when you're in the middle of it? Does something suddenly come out you didn't realize was coming out? And
If there's no surprise, I'm not interested in it.
Don't you think?
I walk away. I mean, I'm in despair if there's no surprise. When you get to those periods where you don't surprise yourself, and then you try to surprise yourself with surprises, and that is self-defeating. And I'm sure anybody who's made art and poetry has been in that situation. Sorry, Carla?
Yes, beautiful in here. So in your deconstruction of narrative, you're reconstructing and not necessarily attached to a viewer perceiving a particular narrative. Is there anything inherent as the artist or as David that you would hope a viewer would glean?
Anything about me?
Inherent in the work, from the work that you would hope a visitor would glean,
Okay.
given that, all that you said?
I would hope the visitor tunes into the general emotional feel, general mood, the general stance through all the clues that exist in the work. That much. And like I say, there's lots of things I hope the viewer, lots of narratives I hope the viewer doesn't construct, like narratives like, well, David must have had a disturbed childhood, or Donald must have had a disturbed childhood because they're doing this. That may be. We both probably did, but that's the case history. That's for psychiatrists to deal with. It doesn't belong in the work of art, in my opinion. It might cause it, but then what I ate for breakfast might cause it too.
Yeah,
They're not
I
relevant.
almost see them more as a map
Yeah.
for me.
I think that's good.
And then that way, there are clues that I might piece together.
A crime scene.
Violent crime scene, yes, throughout history.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Looking at the work, I do think that there is a psychological aspect in your work.
Yeah.
But they also remind me of those children's storybooks, which you can actually fold and they actually have different dimensions.
Yeah.
And
That's relevant.
so I'm really struck by I almost want to get closer right now to see if it is three-dimensional or not, and I really like that aspect.
That's important to me that that becomes an area of confusion and uncertainty and intrigue.
So there is a process of unveiling something hidden behind and going on it. And I was curious about this piece. Did you intend to have it fragmented with paper, or did you actually put it together as it came along, or?
So I took the original wall assemblage, and I'll just hold this for a moment to say my apologies to Donald that I think visual art has, what is the word? Has advantages over poetry in the sense that they're immediately lookable. I'm looking at your poem right now. So the questions are tending to be more about what people can see currently. I think all the questions could apply to poems as well.
Well,
But yes.
I think some of the reasons why artists do work is because it has a cathartic effect.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
So just to answer your first question, this started as one big sculpture which was photographed. From a practical perspective, I can't get something that big paper that big through my printer. My printer's 24 inches wide, so when I print out the photographs, 24-inch width is the minimum, and that's the width of the paper, 24 by 30. It also means I can store it well afterwards. But I did also in this one allow myself, unlike the other big one which conforms to a rectangle, I allowed this one to be a non-rectangular piece as a result of adding sheets together. Because the original sculpture wasn't a rectangle.
Yes.
It was that rough shape.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's the reason that happens. And the fact that the images are fragmented, I think allows me to camouflage or to naturalize the fact that you've got joins between the sheets of paper.
So the overlap actually has a white underneath, or is it the same
It
image?
varies depending on
It
how
varies,
each
oh,
sheet
okay.
printed. Sometimes it's over other prints. You know, you'll say I'm not good with computers, so I can't get each image to be perfectly the same size by clicking numbers and buttons. I do it by eye in the computer. So sometimes they come out very slightly different in scale,
Oh, okay.
and then I'm having to make adjustments. And I don't mind that to a degree. Sometimes if they don't line up along the edges.
Thank you.
Sure. I'd be interested to hear Don's reaction to whether your work is psychological.
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
No question. Yeah.
Probably more overt in most of your poems than I mean, you address aspects personally.
It depends on the
Yeah,
poem, but
okay.
yeah, some of them are very clearly psychological.
Yeah.
Others, it's under the surface more.
Donald?
Yeah.
I might have missed this, I came in late, but for you, what was your entry point? How did you approach a piece to begin working with it?
Okay, well, David sent me digital images of these, so I was working from what I could see on my computer. And I just would stare. I would stare and stare, and then because it was on the computer, then I could hone in, I could, zero in on some aspect of it and pull back out, and so that's mechanically how I worked on it. And I would say with all of these, I had a draft that I thought I was comfortable with, and within 5 days later, I looked at the draft and said, no, that's not really, it hasn't gotten there yet. Revised. I think I sent you early
Yeah.
revisions, and they don't bear much resemblance to
Yeah,
these.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that unusual for you relative to the pieces,
No,
or it just was
that's
your
how I work.
process? Yeah.
That's pretty normal for me.
I'm trying to, it's hard to articulate some of these things, but, I'm just thinking about the process of what you do, which is, in some ways, is a denial and a disassociation and a distancing.
Very much.
So you're taking something that's three-dimensional, that you've touched
Yes.
and built, and denying its three-dimensionality to some extent.
Yes. Absolutely.
And I mean, even though ironically on the piece of paper, it shows its three-dimensionality by the
Right.
shadow and by how you respected it.
Yes.
But it still is a distancing.
Yes.
And then using a drawing or a fragment of a magazine as an object.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I'm just thinking about in the process,
Yeah.
how your relationship is to the
I think
different
that's a good
pieces.
observation, thank you. And kind of provoking in a good way. So I think in a way, it's a platitude that creativity is also destruction. But I think for me, making sculptures and having objects in the world is much more material, much more space invasive than making 2D images. And I think the destruction of the sculpture in the service of another sculpture, or ultimately its effacement by photographing it, I mean, it's preserved as a memorial of itself. These, in some ways, I'm thinking, the big assemblages that these came from, at some point, going to have to be destroyed. So this is a memorial of those, but it's also an effacement of them, a destruction of them. And I enjoy that. I enjoy being that double thing going on. I'm making something at the same time. It's like in India, all the Muslim mosques built over Hindu temples, and then all the cathedrals in Spain built over mosques, and the Muslims in India would actually take the central image from the temple, put it upside down in the earth, put it under the central arch of the mosque, so all the faithful would trample on Shiva as they went in. So I find this compelling. I mean, it's horrific at one level. It's intolerant, but it's also compelling. And I feel like a little bit, and I don't know if Donald could relate to this as a poet, but a little bit that I'm doing that to my own work. I'm both an iconoclast and an iconophile, alternative.
Well, and also when you're, cause I do this in my own work, making three-dimensional things and then photographing them and putting them into paintings. And I never saw the sculptures as pieces of artwork. I called them husks to be able to photograph and light to put into paintings. I don't saw myself as a painter, but I became aware of the physical interaction of the three-dimensional and how you relate to it and how that's different when you're, putting it onto a piece of paper, and how you can kind of play with that as narrative.
And strangely, I feel more natural grappling with the physical stuff than painting. I don't like the giving illusion aspect of painting very much.
Right. Well, you use it as an object.
Yeah.
In the painting.
Yeah.
Cool.
Is there any parallel to that? You?
Well, I cannibalize
Okay.
poems
Okay.
all the time.
Yeah.
So, and that's the great thing about, computers, in terms of writing, it's so much easier. Save version 27 and come back to it 3 years later. And, oh, there's 3 lines that might work in this book.
Yeah. And you don't have the thing in the same way with a poem surviving as a material object, because there's more than one of it. It's a code or a visual art. We have this thing about their material things.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Unless you like Blake and handwriting, Well, I think we probably should wrap this up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And help yourself to refreshments or books,
Yeah, please.
books and CDs.